Hi everyone, it's John Mitchell, and in today's video we're going to look at the concept of the force field analysis. Now in this outcome we've been looking at change within a business, and the force field analysis is a tool that can be used by managers to identify and analyse the forces that will drive a business towards change and also the forces that will resist and work against a proposed change. And these forces we can call or are known as driving forces and restraining forces. So driving forces are those that support the change, and restraining forces are those that work against the change. So the idea is that if a business is faced with restraining forces that are simply too strong and difficult to overcome, then the business will likely find it difficult to actually implement a change successfully. So the force field analysis is a process of identifying and analysing all of those forces to help managers make decisions about what they will be faced with when implementing a change, and possibly even decide if a change is worth pursuing in the first place or not. So in order to conduct a force field analysis, the managers can undertake a series of steps. Now there's no specific set of steps that are listed in the study design. However, this is a typical process that can be used. So the first step, firstly, it's important to actually identify what the proposed change is and what the business is actually looking to work towards. So outlining that change concept first. Then step two would be the team would identify the driving forces, remembering that driving forces are those that will actually help support the change. So driving forces could be people such as managers or other employees that are going to help drive and support the change. It could be that there would be a reduction in costs, or potential to grow the business could also be driving forces. And we'll get into driving forces another time in later videos. So they will then, step three would be then to identify those restraining forces. So those that could work against the change, and they could be things like financial considerations, as implementing a change could be really expensive and put the business under financial pressure, or it could be employees that may be fearing losing their jobs that may be working against the change, and there could be a whole other range of restraining forces as well. So once each of the potential forces has been identified, the team will then analyse each force to determine how strong it is or how powerful it is. So the idea is that for a change to be successful, the strength of the driving forces should outweigh the strength of the restraining forces. To help represent this analysis, there could be that they provide a number out of 5, so 1 to 5, could be allocated to each force, which would represent the strength of each force. And so once all the analysis has been done, the managers will then have a clear picture of the forces that will be supporting or resisting a proposed change. To help gain momentum and help the change become a success, the final step is to then create an action plan that will help reduce the strength of the restraining forces, or even potentially increase the strength of the driving forces. And so that action plan can be labelled with different steps that need to be taken to try and reduce those restraining forces, and they could have deadlines and even have a person allocated to undertake that action. So if we look at an example with Airbnb, now Airbnb moved from a private limited company to a public listed company by listing on the NASDAQ exchange over in the US, and that occurred around in December 2020. So let's use that concept as our example before Airbnb decided to actually float and become a public listed company. Let's look at a possible process or a force field analysis that they could have gone through. So the first step would have been identifying the change, which is to move from a private limited company to a public listed company. Next, the next step would be to actually identify the driving forces. So I've listed just a couple of driving forces that could have been drivers for that particular change and supported that change, such as the increased ability to raise capital from being on a public exchange, which can obviously help the company grow more quickly. There may be greater efficiencies achieved if they become a public listed company. So once they've identified each of those driving forces, and there could have been more, remember these are just examples, the next step would be to identify the restraining forces. And so these could be high costs of going public, the increased reporting requirements, and the reduced level of control over the company, as members of the public can now purchase large stakes in the company and the owners really have no control over that. So once each of those forces is identified, they then need to be analysed to determine their strength. And so you can see here that I've simply allocated a fictional weighting out of 5 to each force, and that the total strength of the driving forces outweighs the strength of the restraining forces. Now, this may be deemed that the change is likely to be successful because of this, because of the extra weighting on the driving forces. So therefore, there's enough force and momentum to push the business towards the change. It's important to note that it's not the number of driving forces and restraining forces that's important, it's the strength of each force. So there could be many different driving forces, but simply one or two very powerful restraining forces, which may make the change really difficult to implement successfully. So it's actually the strength, not the number. Now, once that analysis has been complete, the next step would be to conduct an action plan, which would be developed where tasks would be created and assigned to employees with the aim of either removing or at least reducing the strength of the restraining forces, giving the change a greater chance of being implemented successfully so that those driving forces far outweigh the strength of the restraining forces. So once that's done, the managers can then make a decision about whether it's worth investing the resources into the change, and they get a clear picture of whether they think it's going to be successful. Now, some of the benefits of using a force field analysis is that managers are then able to identify those forces that are working for the change and against the change, so those driving and restraining forces. Now, that information can then be used to determine if the change is worth pursuing, or at least give a clear picture of what the business will be faced with if they were to implement the change. So that information can also be used to help plan the change so that actions and timelines can be developed to try and reduce those restraining forces. And all that goes a really long way to helping the change being implemented successfully within the business. However, one of the issues is that it's difficult to actually identify all of the forces, whether they be driving or restraining forces. So this could make it difficult to plan effectively because there's always a chance that a restraining force arises that has not been considered or that the managers didn't think actually existed. And so therefore, it may then not give a clear picture necessarily of what the business will be up against. Another issue is that the weightings are very subjective. And if a business is actually making a decision about pursuing the change and it's conducted based on the overall weightings of those driving and restraining forces, then that decision is only as good as the person or the team that's actually allocated those weightings. So that can because it's so subjective, that can make things difficult. So just to recap, a force field analysis is a tool that is used to identify and analyse the forces that will be working for as well as those that will be working against a particular change. And we now know that they're called driving and restraining forces. And in future videos, we'll get into different examples of driving and restraining forces. And so for a change to be implemented successfully, the driving forces should outweigh the restraining forces. And a typical process that could be conducted, remember, it's not specifically listed in the study design, but you should know a set of steps that can be used to conduct a force field analysis. So a typical set of steps is to firstly define or outline the change, identify those driving forces and then the restraining forces, and then analyse each of those forces and possibly allocate a weighting to each, whether that be out of 5 or out of 10. Typically that's out of 5, and then develop an action plan that aims to reduce those restraining forces. And that's how a business can actually conduct a force field analysis to determine whether a change is worth pursuing or not. So for questions, activities and more, then always come over to teachingbubble.com.